The ground didn't just shake, it screamed. One moment, the village of Almara was wrapped in the quiet hum of early morning. Smoke curled from clay chimneys. Goats wandered between stone houses. Children ran barefoot toward school, laughing over nothing and everything. The air smelled of warm bread and damp earth. Life moved slowly here, shaped by seasons, not seconds. Then, in less than a minute, everything changed. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling through the mountains. But thunder doesn't tear the earth open. Thunder doesn't swallow homes whole. The ground buckled like cloth yanked from underfoot. Walls cracked with sounds like bones snapping. Roofs caved in. Dust exploded into the sky, thick and choking, turning daylight into dusk. People screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the roar of collapsing stone and timber. When the shaking stopped, silence fell. Not peaceful, but heavy, stunned. Then came the crying. A baby's wail from under a pile of rubble. A man shouting his wife's name over and over, voice breaking. An old woman sat in the middle of what used to be her kitchen, clutching a broken teacup, staring at nothing. No phones worked. The nearest town was a 2-hour walk down a narrow mountain trail, now buried under a landslide. The village clinic? Gone. The only doctor had been inside when the roof gave way. Water pipes were shattered. Food stores crushed. Even the well was clogged with debris. For the first day, survivors dug with their hands. Fingernails split. Knees bled. They pulled out neighbors, cousins, friends, some alive, many not. They laid the dead in rows under torn blankets, whispering prayers between sobs. At night, they huddled around a single fire, sharing one bottle of water, listening to the wind howl through broken walls. By the second day, thirst set in. Lips cracked. Throats burned. A teenage boy walked 3 miles down the blocked road, hoping to find help. He came back hours later, exhausted, shaking his head. "Nothing," he said. "Just rocks. No one's coming." Hope began to fade like the last light of sunset. People started talking quietly in corners. Maybe no one even knows we're here. Even if they do, it'll take weeks to reach us. By then, we'll be gone. An elder, his face lined with decades of sun and sorrow, sat on a fallen beam and said what everyone feared: "We've been forgotten." And in that moment, it felt true. The world outside kept turning. Cars honked in distant cities. Planes flew overhead. People scrolled on their phones, but none of it reached Almara. Here, time had stopped. Every breath felt borrowed. Every hour heavier than the last. Children stopped playing. Adults stopped planning. Even the goats seemed quieter, as if they too understood that something sacred had been broken. On the third morning, a woman found her daughter's school bag in the rubble. Inside, a half-finished drawing of a sunflower. She held it to her chest and didn't make a sound, but her shoulders shook like leaves in a storm. That same day, a man climbed the highest ridge he could reach just to scan the horizon. He stood there for an hour, eyes straining, heart pounding at every distant speck, only to watch it turn into a bird or a cloud or nothing at all. Back in the village, someone started singing an old lullaby. Softly at first, then louder until others joined. Not because they felt hopeful, but because silence was worse. Still, as night fell again, the truth settled over them like cold fog. They were alone. No helicopters. No aid trucks. No voices calling from beyond the mountains. Just the wind, the stars, and the weight of waiting. They had survived the earthquake. But survival, they were starting to realize, wasn't the same as living, and so they waited, not with courage, not with faith, but with the quiet resignation of people who had given everything they had, and now had nothing left to give. They believed help would never arrive, and in the stillness of that broken village, it almost felt like the world had agreed. Hundreds of miles away, in places where the ground didn't shake and the sky stayed clear, life went on as usual. People sipped coffee in tall buildings, scrolled through phones on crowded trains, argued over dinner about things that felt urgent. But none of it mattered much in Almara. Not yet. But then a single image changed everything. A young man from the village, barely 20, with dust in his hair and blood on his shirt, had walked for 2 days through landslides and broken trails until he reached a town with a working cell tower. With shaking hands, he filmed a short video on a borrowed phone. It showed cracked earth, collapsed homes, children with hollow eyes sitting in the dirt. He didn't speak much, just whispered, "Please, no one knows we're here." He posted it online. At first, only a few people saw it. A teacher in another country, a retired firefighter, a student studying disaster response. But then someone shared it. Then another. And another. Within hours, that shaky clip was everywhere. On news sites, social feeds, group chats. People couldn't look away. The pain in that video wasn't distant or abstract. It was real, human, raw, and that's when the world stopped scrolling and started moving. Governments didn't wait for formal requests. Emergency teams were already packing gear before official reports even came in. Satellite images confirmed the worst. Entire neighborhoods erased. Roads gone. No signs of life in places that used to bustle. That was all the proof they needed. But it wasn't just officials who reacted. Ordinary people, people who'd never heard of Almara before that morning, began doing whatever they could. In a small town in Scandinavia, a group of nurses canceled their weekend off and signed up for a medical mission. In a garage in Canada, engineers started building lightweight water filters they could ship fast. School kids in New Zealand held a bake sale and sent every dollar to a relief fund. A truck driver in Germany offered his rig for free to carry supplies. No one asked them to. They just saw a need and stepped in. Messages poured in from strangers. We're sending blankets. We have extra tents. Tell us what you need. We'll find a way. Back in Almara, no one knew any of this was happening. They were still digging through rubble with blistered hands, still rationing the last drops of water, still whispering goodbyes to loved ones under starless skies. But outside their broken valley, a storm was gathering, not of wind or rain, but of compassion. Airports became hubs of quiet urgency. Cargo planes loaded with medicine, food, and rescue gear taxied down runways at all hours. Pilots volunteered extra shifts. Mechanics worked through the night to keep helicopters ready. Even airline staff stayed late to help load crates marked Emergency Almara. One pilot, a woman who'd flown passenger routes for 20 years, said later, "I've never felt so sure about a flight in my life. It wasn't just a job. It was like we were carrying hope in those boxes." Meanwhile, rescue teams from different countries, people who'd never met, began coordinating online. Maps were shared, routes planned. Someone in Japan sent drone footage of similar quake zones to help predict where survivors might be trapped. A team from Chile who'd lived through their own disaster years ago offered advice on how to dig safely without causing more collapses. It wasn't perfect. There were delays, miscommunications, bureaucratic tangles, but none of that stopped people from trying, because this wasn't about politics or borders. It was about seeing another human being suffer and refusing to look away. In living rooms and community centers across the globe, people gathered not to watch, but to act. They folded bandages, packed hygiene kits, wrote notes of encouragement to slip into supply boxes. One grandmother in Ireland knitted dozens of tiny hats for babies she'd never meet, just in case. And all of it, the planes, the volunteers, the messages, the prayers, was aimed at one tiny, forgotten village buried in the mountains. No one in Almara knew their names, didn't know their faces, but these strangers were already giving everything to reach them. Back at the disaster zone, the third day turned into the fourth. Exhaustion clung to everyone like a second skin. A child with a broken arm hadn't eaten in 2 days. An old man with a fever kept drifting in and out of consciousness. Morale was slipping fast. Then, late on the fourth afternoon, something changed. High above the valley, a faint sound cut through the silence. Not thunder, not wind, a helicopter. Hearts leapt. People ran outside, shielding their eyes against the sun, squinting at the sky. Was it real? Or just another cruel trick of the mind? It grew louder, closer, and then, there it was. A red and white rescue chopper, circling once before lowering slowly toward the only flat patch of land left near the village square. Dust swirled. Children froze. Adults held their breath. When the rotors slowed, the door slid open and 2 people in bright vests jumped out, carrying medical bags and radios. They didn't speak the local language, but their eyes said everything. "We're here. You're not alone." One of them knelt beside the injured child and gently checked the arm. The other pulled out a satellite phone and began calling for more help. More supplies, more teams, more time. News spread through the village like wildfire. People who hadn't moved in days stumbled forward, tears streaming down dusty cheeks. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They just stood there, watching strangers work with quiet urgency. And for the first time in days, they felt something they'd almost forgotten. Hope. But this was only the beginning, because what was coming next wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a wave, a human storm, of doctors, builders, cooks, engineers, counselors, and everyday people who'd dropped everything to answer a silent cry from the mountains. They weren't heroes in uniforms. They were teachers, students, retirees, farmers, people who believed that when someone falls, the rest of us don't walk past. We reached down, and now they were on their way, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. And in that choice, Elmara's long night finally began to lift. The first helicopter didn't bring an army. It brought 2 people, a medical kit and a radio that crackled with voices from a world the villagers had almost stopped believing in. But those 2 strangers moved like they carried the weight of 1,000 others behind them, and in a way they did. They didn't waste time with speeches. One knelt beside the child with the broken arm, gently wrapping it in a splint made from a piece of salvaged wood and clean cloth. The other handed out water purification tablets to a group of women who stared at them like they'd seen a miracle. When someone asked, "Why did you come?" the younger one just smiled faintly and said, "Because you needed us." That was enough. Within hours, more arrived, not in a flood, but in steady, determined waves. A second helicopter dropped off a field tent that became a clinic by sunset. A third brought sacks of rice, powdered milk, and blankets still warm from being packed in haste. Then came the ground teams, men and women who'd hiked or driven for hours through dangerous terrain, carrying backpacks stuffed with bandages, antibiotics, and chocolate bars for the kids. They weren't soldiers. They weren't officials in crisp uniforms. Most wore worn-out boots, faded jackets, and tired eyes that still managed to look you straight in the face when they spoke. Some came from countries thousands of miles away. Others were locals who'd heard the news and simply showed up with whatever they could carry: a sack of potatoes, a toolbox, a first aid kit from their car. What struck the villagers most wasn't the supplies, it was how these strangers treated them. Not like victims, not like statistics, but like people. A woman from a coastal nation, her skin sun-browned and hands rough from years of rescue work, sat cross-legged in the dirt beside an elderly man who hadn't spoken since the quake. She didn't push him to talk. She just stayed there, quietly peeling an orange and offering him a segment. After a long silence, he took it. Then softly he said, "We thought no one would come." She nodded. "We're here now." Nearby, a young volunteer from a landlocked country, someone who'd never seen mountains like these, was helping rebuild a shelter using tarps and bamboo. He didn't know the local language, so he pointed, smiled, and mimed hammering. The villagers laughed, not out of mockery, but relief. Laughter hadn't been heard in Elmara for days. By the second day of their arrival, the rhythm of the village began to shift. The air still smelled of dust and loss, but now it also carried the scent of boiling lentils from a makeshift kitchen, run by volunteers who'd set up stoves on flat stones. Children gathered around a woman who taught them simple songs in her language, clapping along even though they didn't understand the words. Music, it turned out, needed no translation. At night, under battery-powered lanterns, doctors treated wounds by flashlight while engineers rigged solar panels to charge radios and phones. One volunteer, a retired teacher, started a quiet corner where kids could draw or write. "It helps them feel safe again," she explained to no one in particular, smoothing a crumpled drawing of a house with a bright yellow sun above it. There were no grand speeches, no cameras chasing dramatic moments, just people doing what needed to be done hour by hour, hand in hand. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The villagers stopped waiting to be saved and started helping save each other. A teenager who'd lost his home began translating for foreign volunteers. A woman who'd buried her brother that morning showed rescuers where the school's basement might still hold survivors. An old farmer, once too weak to stand, now pointed out hidden springs that could refill water tanks. It wasn't charity. It was partnership. One afternoon, a dog arrived, thin, muddy, limping. It had survived the quake and wandered back to the ruins of its home. A volunteer from a country known for its forests knelt and offered it water. The dog licked his hand, then lay down beside him like it finally felt safe. Someone joked, even the animals know help came. But the real turning point came when the first supply convoy made it through the mountains. It wasn't fancy, just a line of battered trucks, driven by local drivers who'd spent days clearing rocks with shovels and bare hands. When they rolled into what was left of the village square, horns honking softly, people ran to meet them not with desperation, but with something close to joy. Boxes were unloaded. Medicine, baby formula, warm clothes, seeds for planting when the soil was ready. A young volunteer handed a packet of crayons to a little girl. She stared at them like they were treasure, then hugged him so tightly he nearly dropped his clipboard. Later that evening, the smoke rose from cooking fires and the stars blinked awake. A group of villagers and volunteers sat together on overturned crates sharing a pot of stew. No one talked much. They didn't need to. The silence was different now, not heavy with fear, but light with shared presence. One of the foreign volunteers looked around and whispered to a teammate, "I came to give help, but I think I'm the one getting something back." And that was the truth no one had expected. This wasn't just about delivering aid. It was about restoring dignity, about reminding people that even when the earth breaks, humanity doesn't have to. By the end of the week, the clinic was running smoothly. Clean water flowed from a newly dug well lined with stones and hope. Children played again, tentatively at first, then with growing laughter. The storm hadn't passed. Grief still lived in every corner. But now it wasn't alone. Now it was held by hands from near and far, speaking different languages but saying the same thing without words. You matter. We see you. You're not forgotten. And in that simple truth, Almara began to breathe again. What started as a trickle soon became a flood, not of water but of people, supplies, and something even more powerful, care. After the first few days, help didn't just arrive, it poured in like rain after a long drought. Helicopters buzzed overhead like busy bees, dropping bundles wrapped in bright plastic that fluttered down like giant leaves. Trucks rumbled up the newly cleared mountain road, horns honking in greeting. Every morning more faces appeared, some tired, some wide-eyed, all ready to work. But this wasn't chaos. It was coordination born from compassion. Volunteers from different countries didn't argue over who did what. They simply looked around, saw a need, and filled it. One group set up a kitchen under a tarp, cooking rice and lentils for hundreds. Another built latrines to keep disease away. A quiet team of engineers tested the ground for aftershocks while teaching villagers how to spot dangerous cracks in walls. And then, there were the dogs. Specially trained search and rescue dogs, brought in from 3 different nations, trotted through the ruins with focused eyes and twitching noses. Their handlers spoke different languages, but the dogs understood only one mission: find anyone still alive. When one dog stopped, pawing at a pile of rubble and barking sharply, everyone froze. Shovels, hands, even breaths. Everything paused. Then carefully, gently, they dug in there. Under 3 layers of broken concrete was a teenager, alive, thirsty, scared, but breathing. The moment he was pulled into the sunlight, weak but blinking, the whole crowd let out a sound that wasn't quite a cheer and wasn't quite a sob. It was something deeper, a release, a reminder that life still fought, even in the darkest places. That rescue changed something in the air. Hope wasn't just a word anymore. It was real. It was in the way children now ran toward the aid tents instead of hiding from them. It was in the way elders sat outside their temporary shelters watching strangers work, and finally allowed themselves to believe this wasn't a dream. Social media, which had first carried Almara's cry for help, now became a lifeline of connection. A photo of a missing girl posted by a volunteer was shared across continents. Within hours, someone in another country recognized her from a school photo online. They messaged the rescue team. Less than a day later, the girl was reunited with her uncle, who'd been searching every camp, every clinic, every roadblock. When they hugged, no one spoke. They just held on like the world might shake again at any second. But it wasn't just about finding people. It was about healing them. A counselor from a country that had faced its own disasters sat with children under a tree, handing out paper and colored pencils. "Draw whatever you feel," she said softly. One child drew a black sky with one small hand reaching up. Another drew a house with a red heart on the door. The counselor didn't fix their pain. She just let them show it, and in doing so made it a little lighter. Meanwhile, in the evening, something unexpected began to happen. Locals and volunteers started sharing stories, not through translators, but through gestures, smiles, shared meals. A farmer showed a young volunteer how to grind grain the old way. In return, the volunteer taught him how to charge a phone using a small solar panel. An old woman handed a warm flatbread to a tired medic, patting her cheek like she was her own granddaughter. The medic, who hadn't slept in 2 days, cried quietly into her hands, but kept eating, because refusing would have hurt the woman's heart. No one kept score. No one asked for thanks, because in that broken village something rare was growing: trust. Even the work itself became a kind of healing. Villagers who'd felt helpless now stood shoulder to shoulder with outsiders, rebuilding walls, hauling water, sorting donations. A teenage boy who hadn't spoken since losing his family began helping distribute blankets. He didn't say much, but his eyes were clearer now, less lost, more present. One afternoon, a group of women from the village and a team of female volunteers from another continent sat together weaving mats from donated fabric strips. They didn't share a language, but their hands moved in the same rhythm: pull, loop, tighten. Someone started humming. Another joined in. Soon they were singing different songs at the same time in different tongues, and somehow it sounded beautiful. That night, under a sky thick with stars, someone brought out a small guitar. A volunteer strummed a simple tune. A villager clapped along. Then another. Then a child danced, just a few steps shy at first, then bolder. Laughter rose like smoke into the cool mountain air. For the first time since the earth shook, joy wasn't a memory. It was happening right now. Of course, pain didn't vanish. Grief still walked among them, quiet and heavy. But it no longer walked alone, and that made all the difference. What made this wave of help so powerful wasn't just the food or medicine. It was the message it carried. You are not alone in your suffering. People had come not because they were paid, not because they were ordered, but because they saw other human beings in pain and couldn't look away. They gave their time, their energy, sometimes their own tears, and in return they received something money can't buy: the quiet certainty that kindness still moves the world. By the end of the second week, Almara wasn't just surviving, it was beginning to live again. Children played near rebuilt shelters. Gardens were marked out with sticks and string. A new school bell, donated by a school halfway across the globe, hung from a wooden post, waiting for its first ring. The storm of compassion hadn't just dropped supplies and left, it had stayed. And in staying, it reminded everyone, villagers and volunteers alike, that humanity isn't just a word. It's a choice. And that day, in a mountain village once buried in silence, that choice echoed louder than any earthquake ever could. Months passed. The sharp edges of grief hadn't vanished, but they'd softened, like river stones worn smooth by time and touch. Almara was no longer a place of dust and silence. It was alive again, not as it once was, but as something new, stronger in some ways, gentler in others. The last of the big aid tents had been taken down. The helicopters no longer roared overhead every hour. Most of the foreign volunteers had gone home, back to their own lives, their own families. But they hadn't left empty-handed. They carried stories, of shared meals under tarps, of children's drawings tucked in their backpacks, of quiet moments when language didn't matter because eyes said everything. And Almara? It carried them too, in memory, in gratitude, in the way things were now built. The new houses weren't just rebuilt. They were reimagined. Sturdier walls, wider doorways, foundations tested by engineers who'd stayed long enough to teach, not just fix. A community center stood where the old market used to be, its roof made from recycled metal and hope. Inside, shelves held books donated from schools across the world, and a small radio station, powered by solar panels, broadcast weather updates, folk songs, and messages from neighboring villages. But the real change wasn't in the buildings. It was in the people. The teenagers who once sat numb in the rubble were now training as first responders. They learned how to treat wounds, how to spot unsafe structures, how to calm someone in shock. If it happens again, one of them said quietly, we won't wait for help. We'll be ready to help each other. The elders, who once whispered that the world had forgotten them, now told stories to visitors, not just of the earthquake, but of the storm that followed. They came like rain after fire, an old woman would say, stirring a pot of stew. Not to save us like we were broken, but to stand with us like we were whole. And every year, on the day the ground shook, the village held the Day of Hands. No speeches, no ceremonies, just people gathering in the square, linking arms, sharing food, and remembering, not only those they'd lost, but those who'd shown up when it felt like no one would. Children planted flowers where homes once stood. Volunteers who'd returned for a visit were greeted like family. Even those who couldn't come back sent letters, photos, seeds for the community garden. One spring, a package arrived from a small town overseas. Inside were dozens of tiny knitted hats, still after all this time for the babies of Almara. The woman who'd sent them had never met a single person here, but she remembered the video that changed everything, and she still cared. That was the quiet miracle. The connection didn't end when the crisis did. Schools in faraway countries still raised money for Almara's library. Engineers checked in online to see how the water system was holding up. A group of artists painted a mural on the side of the new clinic, a mountain, a hand reaching down and many hands reaching up. At the bottom, in simple letters, it read, "Together we rise." Life wasn't perfect. Some wounds still ached on rainy days. Some nights, someone would wake up gasping from a dream of falling walls. But now they didn't face those moments alone. Neighbors checked on each other. The radio played calming music during aftershocks. And if someone cried in the market, no one looked away. They just handed them a cup of tea and sat beside them until the storm inside passed. What the world had given Almara wasn't just supplies or shelter, it was proof. Proof that even in the darkest hour, humanity doesn't disappear, it gathers. It travels mountains, crosses oceans, learns new languages, sleeps on hard ground, all for the simple act of saying, "I see you. You matter." And Almara, in turn, gave something back. To the volunteers who came broken by their own losses, the village offered peace. To the young people searching for purpose, it showed them the power of showing up. To everyone who doubted whether kindness still moved the world, Almara became living proof that it does. Quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. Years later, travelers passing through would notice something unusual about the village. The doors were often left open, not because they weren't cautious, but because they believed help wasn't something that only came in emergencies. It was something you offered every day. A shared meal, a listening ear, a hand to lift someone up from the dirt. They'd learned that the real strength of a community isn't in how it stands when the ground is firm, but in how it holds together when the earth cracks. Open, and Almara held, not perfectly, not without scars, but with open hearts and steady hands. The world had struck like a storm, not with destruction, but with love. And that storm hadn't washed them away. It had watered them. So they grew, not back to what they were, but forward, into something wiser, kinder, and deeply connected to the truth that had saved them. No one is ever truly alone, because somewhere, someone is always listening, and when they hear your silence, they come,